The 1960s was probably the most active decade in the Cold War. Tensions got really high. We almost blew each other up. Then the US and USSR signed the peace treaty. Then the United States got involved in a war in Vietnam that really tore apart the country. A lot of stuff happened in the 60s. Let's start with the space race. As I said, Sputnik launched in 1957. The Soviet Union put the first man-made satellite into orbit. Now, it didn't matter that it was just a metal ball that beeped. We didn't know that, and we could not do that yet. And remember, this was not just a thing of these countries launching up the cool toys into the air just for fun. It was all about spheres of influence and showing that we can do things. Our technology is better than theirs. Our system is better than theirs. We can do big things because we want to. And it was pretty embarrassing that we could not launch a satellite in space before the Soviet Union could. Maybe our system wasn't as good as theirs. And then in 1961, we fell further behind in the space race. Yuri Gagarin, who's staring at you there on the bottom right, was launched from the Soviet Union, and he orbited the Earth several times and landed safely. We could not do that yet. The next month, Alan Shepard, an American astronaut, was the first American in space, but barely. He took off from Florida over there and went up into the atmosphere, above the atmosphere, looked out like, yep, I'm in space. And then he came back down and landed in the Atlantic Ocean, and they picked him up. That's the best we could do at that time. It was kind of embarrassing. We were clearly behind in the space race. And so that had to change. We had to catch up. And that started to happen. In 1962, President Kennedy gave a famous speech where he set the goal to build the Saturn V rocket and put a man on the moon by the end of the decade. At the time, we had actually put someone in orbit, John Glenn, but that was it. We were going to have to build all this technology and spend a lot of money and really work to get this done. And of course, we met that goal. In 1969, in June, Americans landed on the moon. Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin stepped out on as part of the Apollo 11 mission. Last year was the 50th anniversary. I watched so many Apollo 11 things. I love that stuff. If anybody tells you that we didn't actually land on the moon, I'll be nice and say that they are misinformed, because obviously we did. The Soviet Union did not. Did we win the space race? I'm going to say yes, America. Back on Earth, there was trouble in Berlin again. Like I said, Berlin was kind of like the focal point of the entire Cold War. It's where East met West, and this little patch of freedom in the middle of East Germany. Would that cause a lot of tension? And it also caused a lot of people to leave East Germany to go to West Germany. If you recall, Germany had been split into two countries. West Germany was free. East Germany was under the control of the Soviet Union and was not free. And it was possible to leave from East Germany to West Germany, so tens of thousands of people every year were doing just that. Why would you stay in a place where you have no freedoms and very little, economic job prospects or anything, when you got another, West Germany right there? You speak the language. It used to be all one country, so you can get along just fine. And so a lot of people were leaving. That looked bad for communism. Why would any country pick up this system where all these people were trying to get desperately out of? And so East Germany, with permission from the Soviet Union, decided they're going to do something about that. Are they going to make life better? No, they're going to build a wall. In the middle of the night in 1961, East German soldiers started building a wall across the middle of Berlin between the east and the west side, not to keep people out, not to protect their country, but to keep people in, to keep the citizens of East Berlin, of East Germany, from leaving to going to freedom in the west. Now, there was no warning. They just kind of started putting up concrete blocks in the middle of the night. People woke up and there was a wall there. So if you had gone to visit somebody, if you had gone to work like a night shift or something, and you were on the wrong side of the wall, you were stuck. And people did not see friends and family sometimes for 25 years because they were not allowed to switch, to go from one side to the other. So obviously the United States and other Western countries were not very happy about this, and we sent tanks to West Berlin, and the Soviets sent tanks to East Berlin, and the tanks kind of stared at each other on either side of the wall, and nobody did anything because both sides, again, worried about nuclear war. We're not going to blow up the world over a wall, so we didn't. We backed off, and the wall stayed. Here's a little snippet of how it was when it was first built.
Early on the morning of August the 20th, 1961, East German soldiers sealed off the line dividing the eastern sector of Berlin from the American, French and British zones in the west. Building materials were brought out of nearby warehouses, and the notorious Berlin Wall began to take shape, to the great mystification of those on both sides who were soon to be out of sight of each other. The Western powers immediately expressed outrage at this swift and brutal action. The American Secretary of State, Dean Rusk, described the wall as a flagrant violation of the right of free circulation throughout the city, in direct contravention of the four-power agreement reached in Paris in 1949. But it became increasingly obvious there was nothing they could do. As relative was cut off from relative, friend from friend, the pain of it all was quick to spread. But none of this made a dent in the East German government's resolve to go ahead with the wall. They decided to build it to prevent the growing numbers of East Germans from voting with their feet. In other words, fleeing to the West to seek a new life away from the restrictions and disciplines of the communist regime. The wall became a focal point for all that was worst about the Cold War. It became a symbol of a divided world. As a generation grew up behind it, over the years, hundreds tried to escape. Through the defenses, over them, under them. The mayor of West Berlin, Willy Brandt, called on the East Berliners to be patient. You cannot be held slaves forever, he told them. But they had to wait for more than a generation for that prophecy to come true.
And the Berlin Wall was not just a little wall. You saw on that video how they're making it look like just a wall. By the 1980s, it had evolved into like a whole defense system. And there's a video that I'm not going to add to this one because one is copyrighted and two, this video is going to be long enough. But it explains kind of exactly how the setup was. In a lot of places, it was actually two walls. In between them, there were landmines, there was barbed wire, there was booby trap barbed wire, so you touch it and it fires a shotgun at you. There were some metal spikes in the ground, all of it very well lit at all times, day or night, and watched by thousands of guards. And these guards had orders to shoot to kill. They really did not want people leaving East Germany and going to West Germany. And a few hundred people were killed trying to get through that wall. That's how desperate people were to try it. And a few hundred more people actually did make it, but it was not easy. The Berlin Wall is one of the only times in human history, maybe the only time, that a country had to build such strong defenses, not to protect themselves, but to keep their own people in. But closer to home, other things were happening. As you can see, Cuba is not very far away. The giant flag isn't really there, by the way. I just put it there for decorative purposes. In 1959, Fidel Castro had a revolution in Cuba. They had a pretty bad leader before named Somoza. He was pretty unpopular, Somoza was. So Castro wanted to overthrow him, and so he had some support of the people. After he took over in 1959, he started switching the country over to a communist country, and the government took over a lot of businesses, including some owned by Americans, which made Americans not too happy about that. So we started cutting ties with Cuba that had been going for a long time, and then we got so upset that the United States helped try to organize a revolt to overthrow Castro. Now, all this, by the way, is in the article that you're supposed to read during week 4 about U.S. foreign policy. There's a shorter version of that article with just Cold War stuff, also in your checklist this week. But to recap, the Bay of Pigs, the United States, the CIA organized some Cubans that had left Cuba who really did not like Castro to go back and try to overthrow him. And the idea was you'll get a small group of Cubans to go in. The the U.S. Navy would just kind of drop them off basically in this place called the Bay of Pigs in southern Cuba, and hopefully the people of Cuba will rise up against Castro. It was a complete and total disaster. They didn't have enough equipment. They were dropped off in a place that wasn't the best in the big scheme of things, and those rebels were kind of stuck there on the south side of Cuba, getting clobbered by the Cuban army. And actually, one of the ships that had all the supplies also sunk, which did not help. So it was a complete disaster. They called for the U.S. to help, and President Kennedy, who had just been president for a couple months, 3 months, and he had authorized it. It was a plan that was around before he became president, and he said, yeah, let's go ahead and do this. But then, when the plan was going badly, he did not want to send the U.S. Air Force or any other U.S. forces to go in and help, because he thought that would be war. We would be fighting Cuba directly. We're going to start a war. The Soviet Union could get involved. So no, let those guys try to do the best they can. And it was horrible. They all got captured. It was a really big disaster and embarrassment. And it also caused more problems. That's an actual unclassified spy plane picture. Yes, you are authorized to see that. It's okay. And I'll tell you what it is. Fidel Castro, after the Bay of Pigs, told the Soviet Union, hey, I need some help. Those Americans are going to come back, he said. So why don't you give me some more weapons? So they did. They had decided to install some nuclear missiles in Cuba. And the United States was regularly flying spy planes over Cuba. And in October 1962, they saw that there were missile bases being built in Cuba. So that really alarmed President Kennedy and everybody else who knew about it, because those missiles could hit Florida in like a minute or two. It could hit anywhere along the East Coast, all the way up to Chicago, all the way west to St. Louis, in quick, easy range of Soviet nuclear missiles. Which, the more warning you get, the better, and that would give very little warning. So they were kind of freaking out a bit. So when they really made sure, yep, this is really happening, President Kennedy gave a special TV speech where he explained to the American people what was going on, showed some of those classified pictures. Of course, they weren't classified anymore. And he said the Soviet Union must remove those missiles. And he sent the U.S. Navy to block Soviet ships that were steaming towards Cuba with more missiles. And said, no, we're not going to let them pass. We're not going to let you get to Cuba with those missiles. And so the entire world was scared, because the Soviet Union said, no, we're not going to listen to you. We're going to leave them there, and we're going to install more. And so there was a standoff. And so for about 2 to 3 days, those ships kept steaming towards Cuba, and the entire world's thinking, yeah, we got 2 or 3 days to live, because if they start shooting, then everything's going to blow up. The nuclear missiles will eventually be launched, and bye-bye everybody. So it was a really scary few days, especially in Florida, because we were right there. But the Soviet Union blinked. Nikita Khrushchev, who was still the leader, finally said, fine, let's make a deal. They agreed to take the missiles out of Cuba, to turn the ships back, and exchange the U.S. promise not to invade Cuba ever, and secretly promised to take some of our missiles out of Turkey, which was kind of close to the Soviet Union. So they backed off on that one. But the Cuban Missile Crisis kind of scared the leaders of both countries. They think, geez, we got so close to blowing everything up because of a few missiles. How likely is that to happen again? This is a scary situation. This the scary place we put the world. So they did a few things. One, they installed a red phone direct communication system. It wasn't literally a red phone, which is kind of stinks. It was but it was a secure phone line from the president right there in the Oval Office to the leader of the Soviet Union. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, they didn't communicate directly. They were communicating through ambassadors and such, and they figured that if there's another crisis like that, we need to be able to pick up the phone and say, all right, let's talk this out. And so that's still there, as far as I know. I don't think it's ever been taken out. And both leaders also started thinking about, man, is this Cold War thing worth it? We're spending all this money, billions and billions of dollars. We're always looking, spies everywhere, always looking to fight. Maybe we should scale this thing back. Maybe we should not have the world on the brink of disaster at all times. Maybe we should try to make some real peace. And here's a little clip of a speech that Kennedy gave just a few months after the Cuban Missile Crisis, talking about just that.
Today, should total war ever break out again, no matter how, our two countries will be the primary target. It is an ironic but accurate fact that the two strongest powers are the two in the most danger of devastation. All we have built, all we have worked for, would be destroyed in the first 24 hours. And even in the Cold War, which brings burdens and dangers to so many countries, including this nation's closest allies, our two countries bear the heaviest burdens. For we are both devoting massive sums of money to weapons that could be better devoted to combat ignorance, poverty, and disease. We are both caught up in a vicious and dangerous cycle with suspicion on one side breeding suspicion on the other, and new weapons begetting counter weapons. In short, both the United States and its allies, and the Soviet Union and its allies, have a mutually deep interest in a just and genuine peace and in holding the arms race.
So later on in that speech, Kennedy said, yeah, we should sign a peace treaty with the Soviet Union agreeing to at least not have have nuclear bomb tests above ground. We were out there blowing up islands in the Pacific and spewing all kinds of radiation into the air, and the Soviet Union was doing the same thing out in the middle of Siberia, blowing up missiles, blowing up the bombs to make sure they work and kind of showing off how tough we were. We have these bigger and bigger bombs. So both sides agreed to let's not do that anymore. Let's at least, if we're going to test something, let's test it in special underground things so the radiation doesn't spew everywhere. And that is still what the United States does, actually. We haven't had an above-ground nuclear test in decades. So at least that was something. That's a little step towards peace. That push towards peace kind of died out in the mid-60s. First of all, President Kennedy was assassinated when he was in Dallas, Texas, riding in a convertible. Somebody had shot at him, and that's a picture down there in the bottom of his funeral. It was a really sad moment. The United States, we had a young president. Agree with him or not, he was a young, energetic president who had a lot of respect, was a great speaker. It was very inspiring to a lot of people. Suddenly he was gone. So it was a shocking moment. That picture is there's his wife. He had 2 little kids, and those are his 2 brothers standing there as well. And that's his little boy giving a salute to his father as his funeral procession went by, which is about the saddest picture I've ever seen. Then, as the American people, there was millions of Americans watching his funeral live on TV. Very somber moment. And then the news, all the news networks cut over to Dallas, Texas, because a guy named Lee Harvey Oswald, who had been arrested for shooting Kennedy, was being transferred from one jail to another, and this is the first time most people had seen him. So he gets led out of the prison, and he was going between one building and another building. Well, actually, he was going between one building and a police car, being taken to a more secure prison. With policemen around him and a lot of reporters around and such. Suddenly, out of the group of reporters, some guy lunges forward towards Oswald and shoots him point blank, boom, boom, right on national television live. He falls over. There's chaos. Then the TV networks come back to the funeral of Kennedy, and everybody's thinking the world has gone mad. What is going on here? And Oswald died. So we're not sure exactly what his motives were. Did he really do it? Probably. Why did he do it? We will never know. The guy that shot Oswald is a guy named Jack Ruby. He was from Dallas, and he just said that he really liked Kennedy and was really mad that this guy had shot his president, so he went after him for revenge. Is that true? I don't know either. It's one of the big controversial mysteries in American history. All I know is Kennedy was gone, and so the loss really did hit Americans hard. Meanwhile, in the Soviet Union, Nikolai Khrushchev was thrown out of office as well. Now, they don't have elections over there. He wasn't assassinated, but he was kind of pushed out because other officials thought that he had backed down to the United States in the Cuban Missile Crisis. He wasn't being tough enough, and so they shoved him out of office. And luckily for him, other Soviet leaders, didn't go too well after they got shoved out of their offices. They ended up dead usually, but he didn't. He was allowed to retire to an apartment. Not even joking, but he was out of power. So the Cold War went on, and where the Cold War really went bad for the U.S. was in Vietnam. Vietnam was one of those countries that had become independent after World War II. It had been a French colony, and after World War II, the people of Vietnam started fighting for their independence, and they kind of shoved the French out in the late 1950s. Here's the thing, though. Half the country was being run by a group of communists, and that's the north side, and the south side was being run by some non-communists. And so there was supposed to be an election to reunite the country, but both sides didn't really want an election. They wanted their side to just kind of take over, and so fighting started between North and South. Because the North side was communist, the Soviet Union and China, who would also become communist by now, started helping North Vietnam. And because the other side was non-communist, the U.S. started helping them. because the way we thought back in those days was about containment, saying we have to contain communism, don't let it spread. So if anybody says they're against communists, whether they're good people or not so good people, we tended to help them back in these days. And the South Vietnamese leaders were not great people, but they were fighting against communists, so hey, we helped them out. At first, we helped them out just by sending some money and some equipment and some advisors. So President Kennedy, when he was, when he was still alive, he sent advisors like helping the South Vietnamese army with planning and such, not actually fighting yet. Then, after he had died and Lyndon Johnson became the president, he started sending in troops because some Americans had been attacked. So we sent in troops, and then we started bombing. And Congress did vote to authorize the president to send more troops into Vietnam in 1964, and we started doing that. And we were sending more and more troops. And as the next couple years went by, there's tens of thousands, then there's hundreds of thousands of U.S. soldiers fighting in Vietnam. But we couldn't seem to win because the North Vietnamese fought a guerrilla war, which means they didn't come out and fight big battles. They did more sneak attacks. They hid. They knew they couldn't fight us straight up, so they didn't. They just kept the war going, kept dragging it out. It's, to be honest, it's kind of like the same strategy that George Washington used. It might sound sacrilegious to compare North Vietnam to George Washington, but they use the same strategy. Keep the bigger country. You know you can't fight them straight up, so just keep it going. Keep the war going. Don't let them defeat you. And that's what the North Vietnamese did. And no matter how many troops we sent over there, they just would not be defeated. They would not give up. So more soldiers were needed, and so more soldiers were drafted. More young men were drafted to go into the U.S. Army and the other military branches to go fight in Vietnam, which the war became more and more unpopular. If you recall, one of our landmark cases was the Tinker case, where those high school students wore the black armbands. They were protesting the Vietnam War. That was in 1965 when they got in trouble, saying that you couldn't wear those to school. And of course, the Supreme Court said it was okay, but that's a different topic. In 1965, that was not a popular opinion. By the later 60s, a lot of people have said, "You're right, Tinkers. That war is bad, and we should not be there." There were huge protests all over the country. And some of them were a lot of them were on college campuses because that's who was being drafted, people of college ages. Also, there were sometimes veterans would come back and say, yeah, we were against the war. There was big protests, as you see at the White House, big protests everywhere. The war was extremely unpopular by the end of the 60s, especially among young people. And so President Johnson, he had been Kennedy's vice president, and he won election in 1964 very easily. It's one of the biggest election wins in U.S. history. By 1968, he felt like he was so unpopular because of Vietnam that he didn't even run for re-election. He's like, yeah, this people don't support me anymore, so I'm not going to even run. So he didn't run, and Richard Nixon won the election. He had promised to turn more of the fighting over to the Vietnamese and let the United States get out. So we slowly started bringing home troops and started doing more bombing instead of fighting on the ground. It didn't really help. The war dragged on, and we could not get the North Vietnamese to quit. Finally, in 1973, so this is a long time, the U.S. finally leaves Vietnam, and we said, fine, let the South Vietnamese take over the fighting. They did, and they lost. And in 1975, the whole country was taken over by the communists and became a communist country. And if you look in that picture on the bottom right, that's a really famous picture from 1975. That is the U.S. Embassy in the capital of South Vietnam when it was about to surrender. This country had fallen, and the North Vietnamese troops are like right there. And those people are trying to get on the last helicopter, the last American helicopter, out of the country. And those are mainly Vietnamese who had helped the United States, who had worked at the embassy, and were afraid that when the country got taken over by the communists, that they were going to get punished, thrown in jail, killed because they had helped the Americans. So they were desperate to get out. And obviously, all those people are not getting on that one helicopter. So some did and some didn't, and they were like, it was desperate people on that roof trying to get on a helicopter even as it's taking off. Not a good look. The United States really messed that up pretty bad. And it was the first war the United States had ever lost in our entire history. So it really hurt our pride, it hurt our prestige. How can we get beaten by this small country that made us give up? It was pretty embarrassing. And that's kind of how the 70s went, actually. The 70s were not great for the United States. I mean, I was born in the 70s. And maybe your parents were too. But besides that, and also Star Wars came out. I mean, there were some good things. But in general, and foreign policy-wise, the U.S. went through some tough times in the 1970s. The oil embargo, the countries that still sell oil to the United States, like Saudi Arabia and other countries in the Middle East, were mad because the U.S. was helping the country of Israel at the time, and so they refused to sell us any oil, which means that there was no gas for cars all over the country, and signs like that. Pumps closed, gas stations are closed. There was literally no gas. You couldn't get around. It really shut down the country and hurt the economy too. And then we talked earlier about the Watergate scandal, how Nixon got caught doing all kinds of funny business and had to resign, and made people think, geez, there's a bunch of crooks running our country. And then this was in your foreign policy article. In Iran, our embassy was taken over, and some Iranian, basically not really soldiers, just students, took over the embassy and held Americans, 50-some Americans hostage for almost a year, and we couldn't seem to get them out of there. So everything was going wrong. And of course, worst of all, disco. When you have disco in your country, you know things are not going well, and that was popular in the late 70s. So how did the United States get out of this blaze, which means like the Philippines? Well, let's get next to find out.